Blood is thicker than water, but it's also a lot better at hiding the poison. When my brother smirked and whispered, "Dad chose me over your little wedding," I thought my heart would physically break. I didn't know his ultimate betrayal was about to trigger the most spectacular downfall imaginable. In the Sterling family, there was only one son, and his name was Caleb. If you asked my father, Richard Sterling, he would tell you that he loved both his children equally. But actions have a funny way of stripping the paint off pretty lies. My father was the founder of Sterling Logistics, a massive freight and shipping empire based out of Chicago. He built it from a single rusted truck into a multi-million-dollar titan, and from the moment Caleb was born, he was groomed to be the heir to the throne. I, Olivia, was the afterthought. The spare. The daughter who was expected to smile nicely in family Christmas cards and never cast a shadow over Caleb's spotlight. Caleb was 3 years older than me, and he possessed a terrifying kind of charisma. He was handsome, ruthlessly charming, and utterly devoid of empathy. Growing up, Caleb had a sixth sense for whenever something good was happening to me, and he made it his personal mission to hijack the narrative. When I graduated high school as valedictorian, Caleb used my graduation dinner to announce his engagement to his first wife, Chloe. All the toasts that night were about their future together. When I got my master's degree, Caleb coincidentally finalized his first major account for Dad's company the very same day, turning my celebration into a corporate victory lap. I learned to live with it. I built a life outside the suffocating gravity of the Sterling family estate. I became a high school literature teacher, entirely disconnected from the corporate blood sport my father and brother engaged in. And more importantly, I met Robert Brooks. Robert was an architect, patient, grounding, and completely unimpressed by my family's wealth. When he proposed to me during a quiet, snowy weekend in Aspen, it felt like I was finally building a family of my own, a safe harbor. We threw ourselves into wedding planning. I had always dreamed of an autumn wedding, and we miraculously secured a date September 12th at the historic street, Jude's Cathedral, with the reception to follow at the Beaumont Estate, a stunning 19th-century manor overlooking the lake. The date was 18 months away, giving us plenty of time. I sent out the save the dates almost immediately. For a brief, fleeting window of time, it seemed like my father was actually genuinely happy for me. He had even taken me out to lunch at his exclusive club, the Oak Room, and handed me a generous check to cover the venue and the dress. "You're my only daughter, Olivia," he had said, swirling his scotch, his silver hair catching the dim lighting. "I'm going to walk you down that aisle, and it's going to be the proudest day of my life." I cried that day. I actually believed him. I let my guard down, foolishly thinking that for just one day, I could be the center of my father's universe. But Caleb was watching. Over the next few months, Caleb's behavior became increasingly erratic and boastful. He had recently been promoted to executive vice president of Sterling Logistics, essentially running the day-to-day operations, while our father acted as CEO in name only. Caleb was driving a brand new Aston Martin, wearing custom-tailored Tom Ford suits, and dropping hints about a monumental deal that was going to change the family legacy forever. He called it the Vanguard acquisition, a massive international merger with a London-based shipping conglomerate. I didn't care about his corporate chest-beating. I was too busy picking out floral arrangements, tasting cakes with Robert, and securing my dream dress, a beautiful, sweeping A-line gown with intricate lace detailing. 6 months before the wedding, the invitations went out. The RSVPs started rolling in. Everything was perfect. Then came the Sunday dinner in March. Robert and I were seated at the massive mahogany dining table at my father's Connecticut estate. Caleb was there, swirling a glass of expensive Cabernet, a strange, predatory gleam in his eye. My father was holding a stack of leather-bound dossiers, looking stressed but invigorated. "I have a toast," Caleb announced, tapping his fork against his crystal wine glass. He stood up, smoothing the front of his vest. "To Sterling Logistics, and to the finalization of the Vanguard acquisition." My father beamed, raising his glass. "It's the culmination of my life's work. And Caleb spearheaded the whole thing." The contracts are drawn up. The London executives have finally agreed to the signing. That's wonderful, Mr. Sterling. Congratulations, Caleb, Robert said politely, raising his water glass. Oh, it gets better, Caleb said, his eyes locking onto mine across the table. A cold chill washed over me. I knew that look. It was the look of a predator about to snap the trap shut. We aren't just doing a quiet boardroom signing. The Vanguard executives want a massive press event, a gala. We're renting out the grand ballroom at the Waldorf. It's going to be the biggest corporate event of the decade. We sign the papers on stage, followed by a black tie celebration. That sounds like quite the undertaking, I said cautiously. When is it? Caleb didn't blink. His smirk deepened into a full-blown grin. September 12th. The silence that followed was so absolute. It felt like all the air had been sucked out of the room. September 12th? I repeated, my voice barely a whisper. I looked at my father, expecting him to immediately correct Caleb, expecting him to say, "No, Caleb, that's your sister's wedding day." My father looked down at his plate, suddenly very interested in his steak. Robert shifted beside me, his posture stiffening. September 12th is our wedding day, Caleb. We sent the save the dates a year ago. The invitations literally arrived at this house last week. Caleb sighed, an exaggerated, theatrical sound of exasperation. I know, Robert. I saw the invitation. But you have to understand, we are dealing with billionaires from London. Sir Reginald Hayes and his board of directors gave us 2 dates they could fly to the States. One was next week, which is impossible to plan for, and the other was September 12th. I didn't have a choice. You didn't have a choice? I snapped, my shock rapidly morphing into hot, blinding anger. You have 364 other days in the year. You couldn't push it to October? You couldn't fly to London to sign it? It's an optics thing, Olivia, Caleb said dismissively, waving his hand as if swatting away a gnat. They need to be on our turf to show confidence in the American markets. Look, it's just a wedding. You can push it back a few weeks. The vendors will understand. Push it back? I slammed my hands on the table, rattling the china. The venue is booked. The cathedral is booked. We have guests flying in from out of the country. Robert's grandparents are coming from Ireland. I am not moving my wedding. I turned to my father, desperate. Dad, tell him he has to change the date of the gala. My father finally looked up, and the expression on his face shattered whatever illusion I had left of him. It was a look of weak, pathetic appeasement. Olivia, sweetie, my father started, using that placating tone he always used when he was about to side with Caleb. You had to look at the bigger picture here. This merger, it secures our family's wealth for the next 4 generations. It is a billion-dollar deal. Your brother has worked tirelessly on this. Sir Reginald is expecting me to be on that stage, signing the papers and shaking his hand for the Wall Street Journal. Dad, you promised, I said, my voice cracking. You looked me in the eye at the Oak Room and promised you would walk me down the aisle. And I want to, my father pleaded, looking genuinely stressed, as if he were the victim in this scenario. But I can't be in 2 places at once. The wedding is at 4 p.m. The press conference and signing at the Waldorf start exactly at 4 p.m. If I'm not there, it insults the Vanguard board. The deal could fall through. So, you're choosing a press conference over your daughter's wedding, Robert stated, his voice dangerously low. Don't frame it like that, Robert. This is business, Caleb interjected, leaning forward. Olivia is being emotional and unreasonable. She's asking Dad to throw away his legacy for a party. It's my wedding day, I screamed, tears finally spilling over. It's the most important day of my life, and you purposely sabotaged it, Caleb. You did this on purpose. You always do this. Oh, grow up, Olivia, Caleb sneered. Not everything is about you. The world doesn't revolve around your little fairy tale wedding. I stood up from the table, my chair scraping harshly against the hardwood floor. Dad, I am asking you one last time. Are you coming to my wedding, or are you going to this gala? My father ran a hand over his face, looking older and more tired than I had ever seen him. Olivia, please don't issue ultimatums. Just move the date. I'll pay for the cancellation fees. I'll double your wedding budget. You can have it anywhere you want in November. I don't want your money, I sobbed. I wanted my father. I turned and walked out of the dining room. Robert was right behind me, throwing a look of sheer disgust at the two men before following me into the grand foyer. As Robert helped me into my coat, I heard footsteps behind us. It was Caleb. He had followed us out, leaving our father at the table. Leaving so soon? Caleb asked, leaning against the archway. Robert stepped between us. Stay away from her, Caleb. Relax, architect, Caleb mocked. He looked past Robert, his eyes locking onto mine. The mask of the stressed businessman was gone. In its place was a look of pure, triumphant malice. I told you, Caleb whispered, his voice dripping with venomous satisfaction. He wouldn't walk you down the aisle if it meant missing his moment of glory. You thought you could finally have a day where you were the most important person in his life? Delusional. He took a step closer, lowering his voice so only I could hear the final, devastating blow. Dad chose me, Olivia. He chose me today, he chose me yesterday, and he will always choose me. Enjoy your walk down the aisle alone. I stared at the monster my brother was. I didn't scream. I didn't slap him, even though my hand twitched with the urge to do so. A terrifying, icy calm washed over the burning grief in my chest. We're done, I said quietly. You, him, this family. I am done. Oh, don't be dramatic, Caleb scoffed, turning around to head back to his victory dinner. You'll come crawling back when you need a loan for a house. Robert led me out to our car. As we drove away from the estate, I cried until I physically couldn't breathe. I mourned the father I never really had, and the brother who hated me for simply existing. Robert held my hand the entire drive back to the city, promising me that our wedding would be beautiful, even if it was just the two of us. The next day, I called my wedding planner. We didn't change the date. We kept September 12th. I sent a formal email to my father and Caleb, stating that they were officially uninvited from the wedding, and that if they attempted to show up, security would escort them off the premises. My father left me 4 agonizing voicemails, begging me to be rational, offering more money, more bribes. I blocked his number. I blocked Caleb's. For 6 months, I grieved. But as the summer faded into autumn, the grief hardened into resolve. I leaned on Robert, his incredible family, and my closest friends. I asked Robert's father, a warm, jovial man named Thomas, if he would do me the honor of walking me down the aisle. He cried, hugged me tightly, and said it would be the privilege of his life. September 12th arrived. While my brother and father were an hour away in the city, putting on their tuxedos to perform for the cameras and sign their billion-dollar deal, I was at St. Jude's Cathedral, putting on my veil. I felt a pang of sadness, a ghost of what should have been, but it was quickly overshadowed by the overwhelming love surrounding me. I walked down the aisle with Thomas. I looked at Robert waiting for me at the altar, and I knew I had made the right choice. I was finally free of the Sterling family poison. I didn't know it yet, but exactly as I was saying I do at 4:15 p.m., Caleb was standing on a stage at the Waldorf Ballroom, smiling for 100 flashing cameras. He thought he had won. He thought he had destroyed me and secured his crown forever. He had no idea that the Vanguard acquisition wasn't a coronation. It was a trap, and the jaws were about to snap shut. The Beaumont estate was bathed in the warm, golden light of early autumn. The air smelled of roasted pine, expensive champagne, and hydrangeas. As Robert spun me around the mahogany dance floor to an acoustic rendition of Our House, I rested my head against his chest and closed my eyes. I felt lighter than I had in years. For the first time in my life, I wasn't waiting for the other shoe to drop. I wasn't looking over my shoulder to see how my brother would ruin the moment. My father's absence was a dull ache, yes, but it was entirely eclipsed by the fierce, protective love of my new family. Robert's father, Thomas, gave a toast that evening that moved half the room to tears. He didn't mention the Sterlings. He didn't have to. He simply looked at me, raised his glass, and said, "A family isn't built on blood and ledgers, Olivia. It's built on who shows up when it matters. And we will always show up for you." While I was cutting into a three-tiered vanilla bean cake, 90 miles away in Manhattan, the grand ballroom of the Waldorf Astoria was drowning in camera flashes. I didn't see the coverage until weeks later, but the timeline was meticulously documented by every major financial network. At 4:15 p.m., perfectly synchronized with my wedding vows, my brother Caleb and my father stood on a raised dais draped in velvet. Flanking them were the executives of Vanguard Logistics, led by the charismatic, silver-haired Sir Reginald Hayes. Caleb, dressed in a bespoke tuxedo that cost more than my entire wedding catering budget, proudly signed his name on the dotted line of a 200-page contract. My father signed right after him, shaking Sir Reginald's hand, while the crowd of shareholders and Wall Street elites erupted into applause. The next morning, the Financial Times ran a front-page spread. Sterling Logistics secures the crown, the billion-dollar Vanguard merger. Caleb's smug, triumphant face was plastered right in the center. He had done it. He had cemented his legacy, solidified his absolute control over my father's empire, and successfully stamped out my wedding day in the eyes of Chicago high society. Robert and I left for our honeymoon 2 days later, a quiet, 2-week retreat to a secluded villa in the Amalfi Coast. I turned my phone off completely. No social media, no news, no emails. I purged the Sterling family from my mind and soaked in the Mediterranean sun, drinking wine on terraced cliffs and laughing with my husband until my ribs ached. I was blissfully unaware of the storm gathering back home. When we finally returned to Chicago in early October, the crisp autumn air felt invigorating. I was ready to get back to my students, ready to start my life as Mrs. Olivia Brooks. It was a Tuesday morning. I was sitting in the teacher's lounge, grading a stack of sophomore essays on The Great Gatsby, when my phone vibrated. I had unblocked my father and brother upon returning to the States, mostly out of a morbid curiosity to see if they had left any gloating messages about their gala. The caller ID flashed, Arthur Pendleton. Arthur was my father's personal attorney, a shrewd, quiet man who had worked for Sterling Logistics for 30 years. He had known me since I was in pigtails. I hesitated, my thumb hovering over the red reject button, but a strange instinct made me answer. "Hello, Arthur," I said cautiously. "Olivia." Arthur's voice was completely unrecognizable. The usually unflappable lawyer sounded breathless, ragged, and terrified. "Olivia. Thank God. Where are you?" "I'm at work." "Arthur, what's going on? If my father put you up to this?" "No, no, Richard didn't ask me to call." "Richard can't call anyone right now," Arthur interrupted, his voice dropping to a panicked whisper. "Olivia, you need to turn on the news. Any channel." "Why?" A cold prickle of dread traced its way up my spine. "Just turn it on. And Olivia, do not, under any circumstances, come to the corporate office. Do you understand me? Stay away from the Sterling building." Before I could ask another question, the line went dead. My heart hammering against my ribs, I grabbed the remote from the lounge coffee table and turned on the wall-mounted television, flipping it to CNN. The bright red breaking news banner flashed across the bottom of the screen. I dropped my red grading pen. It rolled off the table and stained the floor, but I couldn't tear my eyes away from the television. There, broadcast live to millions of people, was the towering glass and steel headquarters of Sterling Logistics in downtown Chicago. But it wasn't a standard corporate B-roll shot. The plaza was swarming with federal vehicles. Men and women in dark windbreakers, emblazoned with the bright yellow letters FBI and SEC, were carrying dozens of cardboard boxes out of the glass revolving doors. The news anchor's voice was grim. "We are currently watching a live raid at the headquarters of Sterling Logistics, one of the nation's largest freight companies. Sources inside the Justice Department confirm that CEO Richard Sterling and Executive Vice President Caleb Sterling have been taken into federal custody this morning, facing multiple counts of international wire fraud, money laundering, and corporate racketeering." I stopped breathing. The camera cut to a shaky, zoomed-in shot of the back entrance. Two federal agents were escorting a man in handcuffs toward an unmarked black SUV. It was Caleb. His custom suit was rumpled, his hair disheveled, and the arrogant, untouchable smirk he had worn his entire life had been completely wiped away, replaced by an expression of pure, unadulterated terror. The collapse of Sterling Logistics wasn't just a scandal, it was a financial massacre. Over the next 48 hours, the full, horrifying scope of the Vanguard acquisition was laid bare for the world to see, dissect, and mock. Vanguard Logistics wasn't a legitimate London-based shipping conglomerate. It was a phantom, a highly sophisticated, intricately woven shell company designed by a European criminal syndicate to launder billions of dollars in illicit debt. Sir Reginald Hayes, the charismatic billionaire Caleb had been so desperate to impress, wasn't even his real name. He was a notorious international con artist named Gregory Finch, who was currently nowhere to be found, having vanished into the wind the second the ink dried on the contracts. But the sheer brilliance of the trap, and the hard, undeniable karma of it all, lay in the specifics of the contract. A week after the raid, I sat in my living room with Robert, watching a special investigative report on the disaster. The reporter was interviewing Robert Dalton, the former chief risk officer for Sterling Logistics. I knew Robert. He was a meticulous, deeply paranoid accountant who had kept my father's company in the green for a decade. "Mr. Dalton," the interviewer asked, "how did a company as established as Sterling Logistics fall for a Trojan horse of this magnitude? Did no one look at Vanguard's books?" Robert Dalton looked into the camera, looking exhausted. "We tried. My department flagged dozens of anomalies in Vanguard's asset disclosures. I went to Caleb Sterling directly in August. I told him we needed a minimum of 3 more weeks to conduct a deep-dive forensic audit into Vanguard's European holding accounts. I warned him that taking on Vanguard without this audit could expose us to toxic liabilities. And what did Caleb Sterling say? He fired me," Robert said bluntly. "He fired me and my entire team. He said the audit would push the signing date past September 12th, and that the September 12th date was non-negotiable." I gasped, my hand flying to my mouth. Robert gripped my shoulder, his knuckles turning white. "Why was that specific date so important?" the interviewer pressed. "I don't know." Robert shook his head. "Caleb was obsessed with it. He said it was a matter of family business. To ensure the deal happened on that exact day, Caleb bypassed the board's safety protocols and structured the deal as a total liability absorption. By signing that specific contract on American soil, Caleb legally tethered Sterling Logistics to all of Vanguard's hidden debts and criminal fronts. The reality of what I was hearing washed over me like a bucket of ice water. Caleb had a choice. He had the chief risk officer of his own company begging him to delay the signing by just a few weeks to ensure the company's survival. If he had listened, the audit would have uncovered the fraud, the FBI would have stepped in quietly, and my father's empire would have been saved. But delaying the deal meant Caleb couldn't use it to overshadow my wedding. It meant he couldn't force my father to choose between us on September 12th. Caleb's petty, venomous obsession with destroying my perfect day was the exact mechanism that destroyed his entire life. In his blind rush to crush me, he had thrown the gates wide open and invited the wolves inside. The fallout was apocalyptic. Because Sterling Logistics had absorbed Vanguard's toxic assets, the company was immediately frozen by the SEC. The stock plummeted to literal pennies within a day. My father's accounts, Caleb's accounts, the trust funds, the real estate, everything tied to the Sterling name was seized by the federal government to pay off the billions in fraudulent debt they had just legally assumed. They lost the Connecticut estate. They lost the Aston Martin. They lost the legacy. 2 weeks after the raid, I was sitting on my front porch, wrapping my hands around a mug of hot tea, watching the autumn leaves fall. A rusted, beat-up yellow taxi pulled up to the curb of our modest suburban street. I watched in stunned silence as my father stepped out of the back seat. He looked like he had aged 20 years in a fortnight. He was wearing a plain, off-the-rack gray sweater. His shoulders were slumped, his face hollow and gray. He had been released on bail, his passport confiscated, awaiting trial alongside Caleb. He walked up my driveway slowly, as if every step caused him physical pain. Robert came out of the house, immediately stepping in front of me, his stance defensive. "Robert," my father croaked, his voice raspy and broken. "Please, I need to speak to my daughter." Robert looked at me over his shoulder. I gave him a tiny nod. He stepped aside but stayed securely by my elbow. My father stood at the bottom of the porch steps, looking up at me with watering eyes. Gone was the titan of industry. Gone was the man who swirled scotch in the oak room and threw money at his problems. He was just a broken, destitute old man. "Olivia," he whispered, tears spilling over his weathered cheeks. "I am so sorry. I am so sorry." I looked at him, feeling a strange absence of anger. I didn't hate him anymore. I just pitied him. "For what, exactly?" I asked, my voice calm and even. "For missing my wedding? Or for losing your money?" He flinched as if I had struck him. "For everything. For trusting him over you. For letting him blind me." He reached into his coat pocket with a trembling hand and pulled out a crumpled, velvet ring box. "The feds took everything. The houses, the accounts, the cars. But Arthur managed to hide a few personal items in a safety deposit box before the freeze. This was your grandmother's." He held it out to me. "I have nothing left, Olivia. Caleb is facing 20 years in federal prison. My lawyers are telling me I might face 5. I have nowhere to go. I was hoping I could stay in your guest room, just until the trial." I stared at the velvet box in his shaking hand. I remembered the night in the dining room, 6 months ago. I remembered the cold, appeasing look on his face when he told me to look at the bigger picture and just move my wedding date. I remembered Caleb's venomous whisper. "Dad chose me." I took a slow sip of my tea. The air was crisp, and the neighborhood was perfectly quiet. I stared at the faded velvet box resting in his trembling palm. My grandmother's ring. It was a beautiful, vintage emerald cut that I had admired since I was a little girl. My father had kept it locked away in a safe for decades, promising it to me for my 16th birthday, then my 18th, then my college graduation. It was always a carrot dangled in front of me, a transaction waiting to happen. The silence on the porch stretched out, broken only by the low rumble of the idling yellow taxi at the curb. I felt Robert step closer, his hand resting a warm, grounding weight against the small of my back. "You want to stay in my guest room," I repeated, letting the words hang in the crisp autumn air. "Just until the trial," my father pleaded, his voice cracking. "Olivia, please, the press is everywhere. The feds took my passport, they froze the accounts. Arthur is paying for that taxi out of his own pocket. I have no friends left. They all scattered the second the SEC issued the freeze. You're my daughter. You are my only family." I looked at this man, the titan of Chicago commerce, the ruthless negotiator who had sacrificed my entire life on the altar of his golden boy's ego, and I felt absolutely nothing. The well of tears I had cried for him had dried up completely on September 12th. I reached out and gently pushed his trembling hand back toward his chest. "No, Dad," I said quietly. His eyes widened in genuine shock, as if the concept of me denying him was entirely foreign. "Olivia, I have nothing. I'll sleep on the floor. I'll stay out of your way. I'm begging you. When I sat at your dining table 6 months ago, I begged you," I reminded him, my voice steady and devoid of malice. "I begged you to be a father for just one day. I asked you to choose me. And you sat there, looked me in the eye, and told me to look at the bigger picture." "I was wrong," he sobbed, a pathetic, wet sound that made me step back. "Caleb lied to me. He blinded me with the numbers. I didn't know the deal was a fraud." "That doesn't matter," I said, shaking my head. "The fraud isn't why I'm turning you away. Even if the Vanguard deal had been legitimate, even if you had doubled your billions and Caleb became the king of Wall Street, you still missed my wedding. You still chose to sign a piece of paper over walking me down the aisle. You only came here today because you lost." "That's not true," It is true, Robert interrupted, his voice a low, protective growl. You made your choice, Richard. You tied your horse to Caleb's wagon. Now you get to ride it off the cliff with him. It is time for you to leave. My father looked desperately between Robert and me, searching for a sliver of the desperate, approval-starved daughter I used to be. But she was gone. The Sterling family poison had burned her away, leaving only a woman who knew her worth. Keep the ring, Dad, I said, crossing my arms against the chill. Sell it to pay your legal fees. You're going to need it. Without another word, I turned around and walked back into the warmth of my house. Robert followed, pausing just long enough to ensure my father turned around. The heavy oak door clicked shut, the deadbolt sliding into place with a definitive, final thud. Through the front window, I watched my father stand frozen on the driveway for a long, agonizing minute. His shoulders shook, he looked frail and incredibly small. Finally, he turned, shuffled back down the driveway, and climbed into the back of the rusted taxi. As it drove away, taking the last ghost of my past with it, I leaned my head against Robert's shoulder and let out a long, shaky breath. The karma that followed was swift, brutal, and entirely public. The trial of Caleb and Richard Sterling began the following spring, and it became a media circus. Every major news network camped out outside the federal courthouse in downtown Chicago. Robert and I didn't attend a single day, choosing instead to watch the highlights on the evening news from the comfort of our living room. Caleb's arrogance was his ultimate undoing. During the trial, he foolishly chose to take the stand in his own defense. He wore a cheap, off-the-rack suit, a stark contrast to the Tom Ford he was used to, and attempted to blame the entire Vanguard disaster on Robert Dalton, the risk officer he had fired, and shockingly, on our father. Under cross-examination, the federal prosecutor dismantled Caleb piece by piece. They played audio recordings of Caleb explicitly ordering his accounting team to forge risk assessment documents to meet the September 12th deadline. When the verdict was read, the camera in the courtroom captured Caleb's face. The realization that his money, his name, and his golden boy status could no longer save him hit him like a physical blow. He collapsed into his chair, weeping hysterically, as the jury foreman read out, "Guilty, on 24 counts of wire fraud, conspiracy, and corporate racketeering." The judge showed zero leniency. Caleb Sterling was sentenced to 22 years in a federal penitentiary with no possibility of early parole. He would be an old man by the time he saw the outside of a cell. My father's fate was slightly less severe, but no less devastating. Because he had been willfully ignorant rather than the primary architect of the fraud, he accepted a plea deal. He was sentenced to 6 years in a minimum security federal facility for gross negligence and complicity. But the true death blow for my father wasn't the prison sentence. It was the dissolution of his life's work. To pay off the massive restitution ordered by the court, the government liquidated Sterling Logistics. The trucks, the warehouses, the international contracts, and the towering glass headquarters were sold off for pennies on the dollar to a rival firm, Apex Freight. The Sterling name was literally scraped off the side of the Chicago skyscraper, replaced by a generic corporate logo. My father's legacy was erased from the earth. 3 years passed. The ashes of the Sterling Empire settled, and the world moved on. I sat on a woven blanket in the middle of Centennial Park, the late spring sun warming my shoulders. Beside me, Robert was laughing, trying to keep our 1-year-old daughter, Charlotte, from crawling headfirst into a picnic basket. She had Robert's bright eyes and a mop of curly brown hair. As I watched my husband toss our daughter into the air, listening to her squeal with pure, unadulterated joy, I felt a profound sense of peace. I had spent so much of my early life believing that I was broken because the people who were supposed to love me unconditionally saw me as a burden. I had believed my brother's taunts. I had believed my father's empty promises. But as I looked at my real family, the family I chose, the family who showed up for me, I realized Caleb had been wrong that night in the foyer. My father hadn't chosen Caleb over me. He had chosen his own ego, and Caleb was just a mirror reflecting that narcissism back at him. They were two hollow men building a fortress out of quicksand. I didn't lose anything on September 12th. I was saved from the collapse. Robert caught Charlotte, pressing a kiss to her cheek before looking over at me. He smiled, that same warm, grounding smile he gave me at the altar. "What are you thinking about?" he asked, handing me a plastic cup of lemonade. I took the cup, looking out over the sprawling green grass and the bright blue sky above us. I didn't think about the cold prison cells, the lost fortunes, or the phantom ghosts of my past. Nothing, I smiled, leaning over to kiss my daughter's forehead. Just thinking about how incredibly lucky we are. Blood doesn't make a family. Loyalty, respect, and showing up when it matters do. My father and brother built a fragile cathedral of greed and pride, and they ultimately shattered it themselves. I didn't need to lift a finger to exact revenge. Their own venomous arrogance did all the work for me. Today, my life is filled with genuine, unshakable love, far away from the sterling wreckage.